The Pentland Firth is notoriously dangerous. For centuries, in and around the island of Stroma, dozens of ships have either been wrecked or run aground due to the currents in the area. The winter months are the worst. It was often the case that the island was cut off from the mainland due to the stormy seas. When it was inhabited, there were numerous occasions when people could either not get to the island, such as the local doctor from the mainland, or the people on the island were unable to leave to attend events, such as weddings in Wick. However, ships getting into difficulties happened during the summer months as well, with salvage workers from Stroma often seen aiding the stricken vessels in the Firth. On one occasion, these salvagers ended up in the Court of Session in Edinburgh, hoping to net a small fortune for their services. They were to be sorely disappointed. In 1924, the Danish cargo ship, the SS Kentucky, ran into difficulties off the Ness of Quoys near Canisby in Caithness. The ship belonged to a company called Det Forende Dampskibs Selskab, which had been formed in Copenhagen in 1866 out of a number of smaller steamship companies. It became a formidable sailing company under the leadership of the Danish financier and industrialist Carl Tietgen. The SS Kentucky, weighing in at just over 2,100 tons, had been built in 1905 and purchased by the company in 1920 from the Danish-Russian line. She had been named Kentucky in 1923, only a year before she was grounded in the Pentland Firth. The ship had been en route to Newfoundland in Canada from London with a cargo of cement. On 7th August, she began navigating her way through the treacherous Pentland Firth towards the Atlantic Ocean. The weather was calm on this summer evening, with a quiet sea and no strong winds. The crew on board, it appears, simply miscalculated the strong currents in the area, and the boat found herself too close to the coastline. She grounded just a few hundred yards from the high tide mark. As she hit, the ship began to take on water, but the bulkheads appear to have managed to do their job and held, although pumps were used to control the water, which had managed to seep in. However, the incident unfolding in the Firth had been noted by the men of Stroma and those on the northern Caithness coastline. A group of people made their way to the stricken vessel. In their efforts to help the ship back on its way, the coal she had on board was taken off by the men throughout the night, into the early morning. It was hoped the ship would free herself, but she was stuck fast. Later in the day, more coal was taken off, and this time she did move. The engines were reversed, and she made her way back into the deeper waters. The two Stroma men involved in the operation went to the Court of Session in Edinburgh in January 1926, arguing that the owners of the ship and the master of the vessel, Niels Nielsen, hadn't paid for the salvage services which the two men believed had been given to the ship in her time of need. Matthew Dundas and William Bremner believed that the salvage services were worth around £5,000. Lord Murray, who heard the case, understood from the testimonies of witnesses that Dundas was asked by the ship's master to steer the Kentucky out into the Pentland Firth. It appears that Dundas simply wanted to impress the ship's crew, though. He was knowledgeable of the coastline and knew where the difficulties lay, but he thought that by saying he was an amateur, he would impress the ship's crew and make some money into the bargain. Murray, however, taking the statements into consideration, was persuaded that although Dundas was present during the operations, he was no amateur. He concluded that Dundas had interfered and tried to force his services onto the master of the vessel in order to put forward a claim for any reward for helping the stricken ship. Murray was also under the impression Dundas was well known and respected by the local community, and so had a great influence over them. It seems he had acted as foreman in the venture and promised to pay the workers so much per hour for helping to unload the coal. His lordship decided that Dundas was a rather untrustworthy character, and thought that some of the witnesses on behalf of him had been coerced into making the statements they did. In his defence, Dundas alleged he had spoken to the master of the ship, and both had agreed that the court in Edinburgh should decide what payments was to be received for the salvaging service Dundas had given. However, no evidence was put forward for such a discussion between the two men, therefore this was dismissed by Lord Murray. In the end, Murray awarded Dundas £10, which he thought was ample for the service he'd given. However, he also found Dundas liable to the defenders for expenses. Bremner, Lord Murray concluded, had simply been a supporter of Dundas in the action. He believed that Dundas and Bremner had made a deal with regards to any money they received from the court, and took a rather dim view of this. During the court action, the SS Kentucky had been tied up in Aberdeen Harbour, and its master, Neilson, was living in the city until the dispute had been heard. The case was one of the most protracted of its time. The problem with it was the lack of witnesses from abroad. Many of the seafarers on the SS Kentucky had since moved on and were simply not traced. The evidence had also been long-winded and elaborate, and Murray was annoyed at the disproportionate amount of it in such a case. Dundas, for example, had given a convoluted story of what he'd done with the ship, from the steps he'd taken, the orders he had given, and his recounting of the danger the ship was in, which was greatly exaggerated. Dundas had also claimed there was a sunken reef, when in actual fact there was none. Murray found, on the whole, in favour of the defenders. He did concede that salvage in some form had taken place, but it certainly was not worth the disproportionate amount being claimed. Dundas and Bremner left court bitterly disappointed and returned home to Stroma. The SS Kentucky continued her transatlantic crossings until she was sold in the 1950s.